Please join me in welcoming once more Professor Margaret. Everyone's taller than I am. Thank you very much for the introduction, Alice. Today I'm going to be talking about the responsive state, and I thought I'd begin by telling you how I understand the state. The state is an organized system of governance. The state is different from, although ultimately influenced by, the political system, which produces the particular group of people that form the government. People or parties who govern the state, the people or parties that govern the state employ its structures and use its monopoly of legitimate force to organize society. They engage in state functions. They engage in state functions like legislation, law enforcement, policy formation, conflict resolution, and adjudication. They also make provisions for security and raise revenue to support state functioning. In doing all of this, they are both limited and empowered by the legal structures and law, as well as things like political ideology, professional ethics, prior histories of governmental actions, and contemporary understandings of the nation's central or foundational values. Also significant are the current political, cultural, and social understandings of the nature and causes of the problems facing society. Among other things, the state produces law and policy designed to address these problems, and these laws and policies apply to everyone that is subject to the state's jurisdiction. Law's influence transcends governing institutions, reaching into, sometimes even dominating, other realms of social organization. Given the permutation of law throughout modern society, it is not surprising that a legal scholar considers the construction of the legal subject to be of critical importance. The legal subject is not only the subject of law, but a baseline defining the appropriate areas for action by the state, the government, and the legal system. How we understand the legal subject can justify or condemn state action. As a representation of the people, the legal subject serves to clarify the expectations we have for a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. In the last two lectures, I explored how the legal subject was cast as autonomous and independent being, whose primary demand of government was for liberty. He wants freedom from an essentially threatening, inevitably intrusive state, as well as freedom from the demands of others in society. This legal subject initially was shaped by the experience and perceived needs of the founding generation as they moved from British subjects to become citizens of the newly formed United States, and this, of course, occurred well over 200 years ago. The core premises about the legal subject have not been successfully or substantially updated, however. Our contemporary legal subject remains imagined as a fully functioning adult, in charge, and making choices. Unrestrained by the state, he has the liberty to compete with others, knowing he will be rewarded according to his particular talents and his individual initiative and effort. He is epitomized in the neoliberal social roles of economic actor, job creator, entrepreneur, taxpayer, and of course, consumer. During the last lecture, I set out the concept of the vulnerable subject as a challenge to this woefully incomplete understanding of what it means to be human. The recognition of human vulnerability argues for a full range of human experiences, life stages, and capabilities to be folded into the legal subject. And because it does so, the idea of the vulnerable legal subject greatly expands the areas of social organization where it can be asserted that the state state action is not only appropriate, but required. I'm going to do a brief review of vulnerability theory for those of you who weren't present at the last lecture, and perhaps for those of you who were. I don't remember what happened a month ago. All right. The basic foundational premise is that human vulnerability is universal and constant. There is no position of invulnerability. Vulnerability is the human condition. As embodied beings, we are continuously susceptible to change, both positive and negative, in our physical and biological well-being. As well, alterations occur in our needs and circumstances. Importantly, while it is built on an understanding of human vulnerability as universal and constant, the approach also recognizes particularity by incorporating two forms of human difference into the analysis. Taking the life course perspective, vulnerability approach highlights human differences that are development or biological in nature. By contrast, the autonomous legal subject is static. He reflects only an idealized, often unrealized, age-specific point in the life course. Some developmental stages of life are not seen as conferring full legal subjectivity, with childhood being the most obvious example. Different, often protective rules apply to these stages of life, and this difference in treatment is not considered inappropriate discrimination. In addition, there are differences between or among individuals living in society at any particular time. Variations in embodiment that we classify with labels such as race, sex, gender, ability, and so on. The state has found it necessary and important over time to respond to these differences, and currently the law protects those with certain characteristics from discrimination. Anti-discrimination laws emphasize the importance of inclusion and are based on principles of civil rights and equal treatment. The second form of difference highlighted in the vulnerability approach, actually it's more than highlighted, it's foregrounded in the vulnerability approach, focuses not on not on the individual, but on social institutions and relationships, not on individual rights, but on state and institutional responsibility. And what I tried to do in this diagram here is to divide those two strands of difference under universal vulnerability. The concept of embedded vulnerability, an embedded vulnerable legal subject, calls attention to the variations among us because we are inevitably but differently positioned within webs of social institutions and relationships. Our interactions within these social institutions and relationships have been extensively addressed in law, beginning with the Constitution, but also including the more mundane areas of law, such as contract, tort, criminal, family, and corporate law. And the law part of this is at the bottom here. But those laws, with few exceptions, are still built around the perceived needs and aspirations of the autonomous liberal legal subject, which is, in fact, the standard for determining what social conditions are susceptible to state action and what remedy the state has the authority to offer. In my first lecture, I discussed how this legal subject shaped constitutional law, but it is equally influential when it comes to common law and statutory law. I claim that if the vulnerable legal subject displaced the autonomous legal subject, it would be possible to expand the notion of legal harm beyond what we now have and address the social harm that can result from the malfunctioning of society, harms that arise from defects in society's organization and its institutions that result in unacceptable levels of inequality and injustice. Note, a vulnerability approach does not reject a civil rights or anti-discrimination approach. Rather, it supplements it by recognizing that there are many serious social harms, such as poverty, a crumbling infrastructure, unwarranted privatization, and public health epidemics that transcend individual intent and action and inaction and are not intentionally directed at only some specific groups in society. These are conditions that harm us all. And certainly we need some concept of harm mandating the state respond when institutional practices and arrangements unjustly disadvantage, subjugate, and subordinate individuals, even if they do so indiscriminately. The remedy for such social harms would also be social in nature, the use of law to adjust those institutions or relationships, laws that are designed and implemented by a responsive state. Crafting the argument for a state responsible for social harm begins by recognizing that societal institutions and relationships are vitally important to the health and well-being of both the individual and society. The family, the market, and financial and educational systems, and so on, are the institutions where we accumulate the material, cultural, and social resources that give us resilience as individuals. Resilient individuals have the wherewithal to form relationships, undertake transactions, take advantage of opportunities, so on, confident that if they fail to meet the challenge or face unexpected obstacles, they are likely to have the resources and the ability to recover. And resilience is required for us to actually be active and contributing participants in society. Significantly, individuals are not born resilient. Rather, resilience is produced over time in social relations and within the ecological systems of society with their intersecting social structures. In fact, in policy pronouncement, legislative histories, party platforms, and political rhetoric, those who govern us refer to the role of these institutions and extol their virtues. Economic institutions are cast as market builders and wealth and job creators, risk takers and entrepreneurs, paving the path for economic and prosperity for the entire society. The family is praised for its self-sacrificing values, which are argued to uniquely qualify it as the institution to attend to the dependency and needs of its members. In other words, we routinely recognize that these institutions have a central and essential role in organizing society. We enact laws to facilitate their creation and ease their functioning. We protect and support financial markets and employment systems in their social and reproductive task of strengthening the economy. We do the same for the family in its role of producing the next generation of citizens and caring for those in need of care at the end of life. It seems obvious, therefore, that the law and the legal system, the clear manifestations of the authority of the state, should be attentive to how these institutions are actually functioning individually and together. And are they in fact operating to enhance the well-being of both individuals and society? Rather than looking at these institutions as components of an interrelated macro system, we have created an overarching classification system. We draw distinctions between the public and the private spheres into which we sort institutional relationships and institutions. In American legal culture, the idea of the private functions as a principle of state restraint. It mandates that the government abstain from direct intervention in significant areas of social and economic life. That veneration of the private acts as a major obstacle, therefore, for those seeking to craft laws and policy more responsive to the social harms of inequality of wealth and power in society. Since the founding generation, separate spheres ideology has envisioned public and private domains with little overlap. The state is cast as the quintessential private domain in which public policy and laws are located, along with politics and other endeavors. But because it is supposed to be restrained, the state is primarily conceptualized as a shadowy background for the activities occurring in the other domains. The family is the quintessential private institution, private in its relationship with both the market and the state. The state should not readily intervene into the family, and the market has no direct responsibility for the family. The idea of family privacy protects the family and other intimate entities from state interference, while individual privacy shields certain intimate decisions from state control. I thought this was an interesting slide for a couple of reasons. One is that the lines are drawn, the larger ones around the family as an institution, the smaller ones around individuals. And there is a comparative, so if you know, the first is the US, then Sweden, and China, Arabia, Iran, and India. And the position of the lines of privacy around individuals, I think, is particularly interesting in this. On the other hand, the market is truly a chameleon-like institution. It is cast as public vis-a-vis the family, but it is private when paired with the state. This dual version of the private means the market is positioned as both free from state regulation and control, and free of imposed direct responsibility for the well-being of the family. Economic institutions such as the corporation and commercial practices, like those that govern wealth accumulation and distribution, are shielded by the black box of the free market. Any damage they do is dismissed as the result of individual choice. In the free market system, the separate spheres of family and market ideally work together to complement each other, to complete each other. They provide for individual and societal needs independent of an overarching and intrusive state. This is a diagram of the consumer society. Also contributing to an understanding of the state as irrelevant or diminished is the academically fashionable tendency to talk about the shrinkage and weakness, one can even say the withering away of the modern state. The suggestion is that one effect of globalization has been the displacement of the state by multinational corporations, treaties, and other non-governmental international organizations. There is a different interpretation. The state is not withered away, it has been repurposed. It has been diverted from fulfilling the traditional fundamental role envisioned by the social compact to act as the ultimate guarantor of conditions sufficient for the flourishing of an equal and just society. It now serves the neoliberal state. A vulnerability approach questions the coherence of the public-private divide and the logic of state restraint. Certainly, since the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, we have had a very active and involved, some would say a radically interventionist state. Modern intimate and economic entities are clearly the creations of the state, in the sense that they are brought into legal existence by the mechanisms of the state, by law. At most, they are quasi-private institutions. For example, the modern state determines how and when both family and corporations are created as intelligible legal entities and entitled to act as such in society. It defines not only who can constitute a legitimate institutional entity, but also determines the consequences of that union. And this is true for both family and corporate units. Once a legal unit is recognized, the law also sets forth the conditions and often the terms of its termination or dissolution. As Joan Scott noted a decade ago in regard to the family, the modern state constitutes itself through the exercise of legitimate force in bringing social institutions into legal existence and subsequently regulating them under its mandate of public authority. Many economists, of course, would respond to the assertion that social institutions are at best quasi-public by noting institutional structuring is increasingly handled through private ordering, through contract. Contracts, however, have no independent force. They are merely documents, pieces of paper, dependent on the institutions of the state to give them life through interpretation, implementation, and enforcement. No matter how we try to isolate transactions and institutions as private, the state is always at least a residual player. And a residual player having fashioned both the background rules that shape those agreements and maintaining the background institutions upon which parties ultimately rely in working through them. The question presented, therefore, is not whether the government should be involved, but what kind of role will it have and how will that role be manifested. The state's unique role as the creator of legitimate social institutions and relationships, I argue, should mean that it has some corresponding responsibility to see that these social organizations operate in a just and equitable manner. And that, of course, brings me to the remaining question: how would the state responsibility be defined and implemented under a vulnerability analysis? And this question, of course, has both empirical and ethical dimensions, and answering it is an immense and multifaceted project that requires actually the engagement across many scholars across many disciplines. But in undertaking this project, to me, it's essential to keep the vulnerable subject front and center as the pole star guiding inquiry. Okay. Remembering that it's the government that mobilizes the power and authority of the state, here are some preliminary thoughts. First, traditionally classified public institutions must be expanded and strengthened, and greater social investments must be made in these institutions. In addition, the government of a responsive state must ensure equity in subsidy and support of public institutions. And what do I mean by that? Within the educational system, for example, the government should aim to ensure that schools have comparable capacity and all are able to effectively deliver the educational services that students need. This is not an approach based on equality, nor is it neutral in regard to the different demands that differences in circumstances create. It recognizes that the status quo may be an unequal one and gives the state the ability to respond to the uneven needs of students and teachers within specific schools. This may mean uneven amounts of funding for some schools, but the rationale for differentiation is superior need, not the wealth of the neighborhood or the tax base, property tax base. Also, there seems to be benefits in providing more substantial support for those institutions that organize early life and are foundational in the building of resilience. This seems to be the case certainly with early childhood education, and it truly is relevant when considering health and community building policies. In addition, the government of a responsive state would also ensure that there were sufficient resources to establish effective public programs that supplement and support quasi-private institutions such as the family, social service agencies. Again, this is particularly relevant when the quasi-private institutions are the ones that are responsible for the early stages of life where vulnerability is most apparent or when it's realized on dependency on care. As for the category of institutions traditionally classified as private, those institutions that I'm calling quasi-private, the government of a responsive state would accept that it has some responsibility for diligently monitoring institutional functioning. The degree and nature of responsibility might vary across institutions, the family perhaps more shielded from state regulation than the market. Monitoring of both is now badly accomplished by agencies and courts set up to address specific instances of abuse, neglect, fraud, and so on. These infractions are mostly considered to be instances of individual failure, with governmental action coming after the fact, often in a punitive form. We need to start thinking of these instances as also governmental failures. A responsive state would work with quasi-private institutions to ensure that such failures are exceptions. On the market side in particular, our current approach to institutional failure is badly in need of rethinking and reforming. The state has a right to monitor the day-to-day functioning of market institutions, a right arising from the continuous funneling of state or collective resources to market institution that occur in our modern society, our modern economy. This support and subsidy is justified by the government as being in the public interest, as creating jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In fact, the neoliberal state has indeed been very responsive to the needs and vulnerabilities of the market. Scholars interested in social justice can expose the degree to which quasi-private market institutions have in fact greatly benefited from public investment, but fail to reciprocate by functioning in a socially responsible manner. What I'm trying to argue here is that a responsive state and a just government must ensure that the relationship between quasi-public institutions and the state are not parasitic, but cooperative and symbiotically beneficial in nature. All too often, that is not the case. And a few recent examples, specific examples of parasitic relationships might help us to see that. The National Institute of Health has invested over $30 billion in research and $300 billion in research and development over the past decade. Yet so-called private pharmaceutical companies reap the benefits when that basic research is developed into Me Too or copycat drugs. Most of the company's investments, in fact, are not in basic research, but in marketing and publicity of the drugs that they develop off of the government's basic research. Those expenses, marketing and publicity, incidentally, are tax-deductible business expenses. Turing and Valiant pharmaceutical companies created outraged headlines when they dramatically raised the prices of some drugs recently, over 700%. But the state had no power to moderate those prices in the so-called private market, even though its initial investments are what made the drugs possible. Last year, Pfizer merged with a much smaller Irish company called Allergan, a maneuver that's called tax inversion, which allowed it to formally locate its headquarters, but not its operations, into Ireland and invade U.S. corporate taxes. Elusive corporate structure and strategic location of headquarters has resulted in technology companies such as Apple and Google paying an average 1/3 less in corporate taxes than other Standard & Poor companies. Apple's tax rate last year was less than 10%. Note also that after only one generation, most Apple manufacturing jobs in America disappeared. The work of building and assembling the machines was turned over to what are called sweatshops in China and other countries. Interestingly, the iPhone of today is smart because of basic and applied research investments by the state. Obviously, of course, the iPhone is dependent on the internet, and the progenitor of the internet was a program funded by the Defense Department. But touchscreen technology was also the product of public investment. A public university professor and his publicly funded graduate student, both of which were funded by the National Science Foundation and the CIA, developed that technology. A National Science Foundation grant produced the algorithm that led to Google's search engine. Silicon Valley as a whole can be seen as the product of federal spending on military and state support for an industry-university partnership built around Cold War defense policies. Joseph Stiglitz, commenting on the Great Recession, concluded that American capitalism privatized the gain from financial speculation from the housing market, but socialized the losses that accrue from crisis and failure. You could say also, when it comes to basic research and technology and technical and pharmaceutical intervention, we have socialized the risks of failure and privatized the rewards of success. One commentator recently suggested the state should retain ownership of these kinds of innovations and then gain an equity interest in the companies that successfully develop those innovations into a consumer product. In that way, the state would earn some returns on its initial investments in basic research. I think this is a particularly compelling application of the neoliberal axiom that the government should act more like a business. The revenue generated could be then used to fund future innovative research and development. In addition, the government of a responsive state would also care about the individuals harmed when businesses act in a socially irresponsible or cavalier way. Perhaps ensure that it was not only employees, for example, that accrued the cost when companies outsource jobs, and requiring companies to provide severance pay and retraining or other kinds of benefits. Finally, the government of a responsive state would recognize that it has direct responsibility to the vulnerable subject to revise the laws that currently govern our relationships with each other, contracts towards property, employment, so forth. These laws set forth institutional or social identities within both public and quasi-private institutions that affect practices, priorities, values, and norms in society. Some of these social identities are clearly public, but others may be erroneously seen as private arrangements based on religious, cultural, or historic practices or traditions. And here, just employer-employee, parent-child, debtor-creditor, teacher-student, we could add to this lawyer-client, doctor-patient, manufacturer-consumer, shareholder-society, it goes on and on. Social identities operate in relation to one another and reflect positions of privilege and disadvantage within relationships and institutional arrangements. This has significant implications for society as well as for individuals. I put these the abuse of power relationships in the context of both family and employment here. The law is part of this institutionalization process. It has a role in establishing authority and compelling conformity and obedience. And to the extent that social identities are legitimated by law, the state should assume some responsibility for them. Some social relationships are based on unrealistic and incomplete conceptions of the needs, capacity, and capacities of actual human beings that are caught up in social situations. For example, the mythical autonomous legal subject with his fetish for individual freedom is the image that shapes the legal meaning and implications of the so-called employment contract. This contract is perceived to be one between equally autonomous parties and obscures the vast imbalances in bargaining power, risk, and resilience that exist between employers and employees. This legal definition allows the employer to impose what is essentially a contract of adhesion on the employee, dictating terms that they alone determine. So too, the concept of parental rights is based on the legal fiction that parents are always the best informed as to their children's needs and that they always act in their children's best interests. The children are not capable of acting in an autonomous and independent manner, so they are cast as the responsibility of their parents, whose actions are shielded from scrutiny by the doctrine of family privacy. This legal fiction undermines the sense that there should be some independent and concurrent public responsibility for the well-being and development of children in this society. It also can operate to shield possibly detrimental parental actions and decisions from public scrutiny and interference. In addition, it's no secret that the laws governing corporations broadly favor the social identities of shareholder and manager. Corporate law is built around legitimating and privileging the pursuit of profit in their interests. Absent specific laws to the contrary, business entities are mandated to put the potentially competing interests of consumers, employees, the environment, and society second or third, if at all. The government of a responsive state fails the vulnerable subject in not responding and mediating these imbalances of power, risk, and resilience that currently are inherent in some social identities and relationships, or at least a questioning and explaining why those imbalances should be reinforced by and enforced in law. So I want to conclude. In these 3 lectures, I have endeavored to present the world a bit differently than a traditional legal scholar would do. Although I would not call my world upside down, as this map is labeled, rather it is a world that is seen from a different perspective, that of the vulnerable subject. In this last lecture, I have suggested a few ways we might be able to use a vulnerability approach to achieve greater social justice. I believe there is an urgent need to aggressively reorient the contemporary neoliberal state that is now so destructively attentive to the needs of the market. The objective of a vulnerability approach is to urge the state to act in ways that are at least as responsive to the needs of the vulnerable subject. So I hope you have enjoyed these lectures as much as I enjoyed giving them, and I want to thank you very much. Any questions or comments?
So you talked about, or I guess I'd like to ask about some social programs in the United States that seem to address questions of vulnerability. I'm thinking, especially on the kind of lifespan timeline, thinking of Social Security on the one hand, and the move, or the push towards universal pre-K on the other hand. And how both of these programs tend to be targeting vulnerability, but also violate one of your propositions about what the vulnerability state response should be, which is one of equity and not equality necessarily. Yeah. And whether that is a stepping stone to trying to achieve that kind of focus on vulnerability, or is it something that is so focused on individual rights or equal access that is problematic?
Well, I think first of all, Social Security is under attack right now, and Social Security is developed not as something to meet need necessarily,
right.
But rather something that arises from contributions that have been made by workers to Social Security funds, right, to the Social Security program. So that's a different, it's not, and in fact, there's been a lot of criticism of Social Security because, in fact, people are living longer and they're outliving what could reasonably consider to be their contribution to the Social Security fund. So anyway, it's not exactly that way. But I do think that Social Security was successful because it is a universal program, and it's extremely important to do that. But making it a universal program doesn't say that that means that the distributions have to be universal. I think that you can fashion those around the need. And as I understand the move for universal pre-K, that is in fact what they're doing. I mean, they're pouring more money into poor neighborhoods, so there's more interest in doing that. So that would be consistent with that, yes. But again, under attack. Everything is a struggle. Okay. Yeah.
This weekend, we had a number of articles in the New York Times about the Carrier plant, air conditioning plant closing in the Midwest,
right.
Sending those jobs to the maquiladoras over the border, and that was resonant. Here is sort of, in some ways, sort of embodying some of this idea of vulnerability and the vulnerable subject, though no one's talking about that in our current political discourse. And in fact, we find that Donald Trump, who is nowhere near your vision of a state response to the vulnerable subject, sort of resonating with these very vulnerable subjects, but in a way that's, well, perhaps fascist might be a little strong, but certainly very, very much falling in the neoliberal individual mode of response and personal responsibility, and not looking at all of the institutions and relationships. And just kind of curious how at this moment, when we're actually seeing a whole bunch of policies that have been undertaken since the last 30 years since the Reagan administration that's in fact, sort of amplifying the vulnerability of the most vulnerable, and sort of doing completely the opposite. How we might sort of think about shifting this and transforming this.
Yeah, well, again, when we're thinking about transforming and shifting and revolutions and whatever we're thinking about, I think it's really important to keep the image of the vulnerable subject as the pole star, central to that. So I have to respond to your comments by saying there is no idea or notion of most vulnerable or more vulnerable. That is universal, and in fact, insisting on that makes it evident that what we need to do, or what a responsive government needs to do, is to plan ahead for totally foreseeable circumstances, like businesses closing down and moving out of the state. So when they provide incentives for businesses to move to the state, when they provide the infrastructure, the roads and the education, so forth, that attracts those businesses, they build into their arrangements and contracts with those businesses exit provisions that benefit the society and don't just leave it to be a unilateral decision of the corporation how to act. Now, Donald Trump, as I recall, said that he would tax all those Carrier air conditioners every time they came back, recognizing that the market, he does recognize actually that the market is here, that they're getting tremendous benefits from the consumer market that exists in the United States. And what he's going to do is handle that with taxation, which violates all sorts of other things. I suggest that a responsive state would plan ahead for that. That's not an unforeseeable event. And in fact, if you plan ahead for it far enough, what you can do is perhaps prevent the move, and in the first instance. And then also, it seems to me not unreasonable to demand that when businesses do that they in fact have to plan for the well-being of those they leave behind. The community, generally, the employees in particular, and in fact in other countries that does happen some. There is some more attention to the devastation that's left when businesses in fact move. So again, I think this moment in time and the discontent with the organization of society, particularly its economic organization, I find encouraging from a vulnerability perspective because it opens the door for these kinds of proposals, which I also find it encouraging actually that a lot of young people are adopting the idea that they can be socialist, or they're more afraid of capitalism than socialism. I find that encouraging also, and maybe it is time for the vulnerable subject to emerge from all this social discontent.
Can I ask you about a couple of places where I'm starting to see kind of utilization of resources on behalf of the vulnerable subject? And I'm thinking of a program in Florida and a number of other states that have set up girls' courts, which are sort of juvenile detention programs that are sensitive to the kinds of issues that put girls into that position. Or I'm thinking of a different program that's sort of looking at sex trafficking, but using the language of vulnerability to argue that in fact what you're talking about is child rape because of the propensity for the people being trafficked to be underage. So I'm wondering if you see some places where we've been cracking through this, and I'm a historian, so I'm also thinking about the fact that those have parallels in the 19th century, and people fought to get rid of them.
Yes.
Right? Because of the way in which they are rooted in the essentialist idea of who that subject is.
Yes. Well, again, that's why I think that a lot of work has to be done on actually how the state is functioning, and that there's a whole idea that we should have an inactive or unresponsive state, when in fact we have a very active state. The question is acting in whose interests, and that has to be the kind of central inquiry. I like the idea of courts that are really sensitive to the vulnerable subject caught in the criminal justice system, which is the way that I would put that. And I think that they have to be. I think that's part of being a responsive government, a responsive state. I also like the idea of things like restorative justice that bring in not only the state but the community in deciding what kind of penalties are there. But in these instances, what we're really talking about is failure, right? And how do we respond to the market failure, so not the market, but to the failure. And here I would like to see a little more attention also paid to how we make these instances rarer, less prevalent. How it is that we build in what I suggested, the public institutions and public supports for the quasi-private institutions such as the family. I mean, how is it that we build those, that we do preventive social services, not only things that occur after there's been a tragic circumstance that occurs. So, yeah.
I was thinking about maybe the models that we have out there already. I don't know, I focus on Latin America, so I'm thinking of Scandinavian countries. Are there countries out there that you see perhaps are providing a model for the kind of responsive state that you were talking about?
Certainly, historically, the Scandinavian countries did, although there is a vulnerability project actually located in Lund, Sweden, and they recognize the need for vulnerability analysis to fight off attacks on that system, which I think is quite interesting. Which brings up, too, one of the things that's happened as a result of my interaction with the group in Sweden, is that I began to realize that privatization, which of course is all the rage worldwide, privatization takes many different forms. And you can think about privatization as an act of a responsive state. The state is responding to a perceived social problem, the problem being the inefficiency of governmental institutions, right? The social welfare institutions and prisons and whatever. But privatization takes many different forms. So in the Scandinavian country, privatization is occurring, but the government retains some control. It's this idea of retaining control. And it by no means means that the government loses any responsibility. So for their pharmaceutical industries, for example, the government no longer runs the pharmacies. They no longer have the state pharmacies, but they do control the amount of profit. They control the prices of drugs, which is a very different form of privatization than we have here. But these neoliberal principles are worldwide. I mean, even in China, you start to see them. It's really Chinese capitalism is a neoliberal capitalism. Yeah.
So I study social movements.
Yeah.
And the legal structure on the left, right? Anti-discrimination law, various forms came about because of activism that was based not exclusively but primarily in the categories of gender, of race, of class, and labor, right? That are a really different model from the idea of the universally vulnerable subject. So I'm interested in your thoughts about who the actors, the social movement actors, the political actors that would bring about a shift towards a responsive state might be, given that we want to conceptualize vulnerability as universal, but it's really difficult to mobilize social protest or political pressure by universal, undifferentiated groups.
Yeah, I would differ with the history a little bit. So I agree with the mobilization around gender, for example, race, sexual orientation, whatever the category is. But I would exclude labor from that, although I think there were early social organizations. Yeah, so, but an interesting thing that's happened, I think, is that in fact these later categories that move away from employer-employee, labor kinds of categories, or class kinds of categories, is that they actually knocked out some progressive reforms in the labor context. And you can see that particularly with gender, where you had early reformers of the workplace trying to put in protective labor legislation. But our way of thinking about the individual's autonomy and so forth really makes the idea of state protection very suspect. And in fact, women organized against the rules that would have provided some protections, particularly for working class women who were also mothers. They didn't want that kind of protection. So in fact, it's these later emerging categories of identity around which people organize that somehow, sometimes derail the more widely based notions of reform. It was always the intention, for example, of the people putting in work and hours regulations for women to expand that to include all workers, but they saw women as a kind of cultural wedge whereby to gain that. So when I talk about identities, again, it's those social identities that I think we have to organize around. We are, all of us, consumers. We can organize around that. We are, all of us, taxpayers. We can organize around that. We all are, these employees. We can organize around that. And those are the categories that I think are most productive for organizing in the 21st century, given the problems that we face and the problems with the neoliberal state.
Can I ask a follow-up?
Sure.
What about categories that are categories like caregivers, unpaid caregivers of children or the elderly, which are highly gendered in practice, but not in theory? What do you see in terms of mobilizing around those?
Again, the analysis doesn't say that discrimination doesn't exist, nor does it say that there might not be an impact on a subgroup of population that's greater than other groups of the population as a result of those practices. But those employment practices, that whole relationship is structured to be free of minimum wages, for example. The attacks on unions and the inability to unionize, or those sorts of things, I think, are where we should focus for helping generally, not only those specific jobs, but people in lots of other jobs. Yeah.
So maybe a follow-up question on Nancy's two-part action. I appreciate your positive and optimistic vision of politics here, so I want to go to the dark side, of course.
I didn't think it was positive, yeah.
First, I'm wondering how you see restructuring of the state emerging so that the kind of responsiveness to vulnerability that you're talking about isn't eventually actually attacked as it has been in the past in various forms by capital. I mean, so you just mentioned unions, and capital has stuck around over the last couple of decades, been very successful at undermining unions in this country, regardless of the history of union development. And we can multiply that in many other directions. Second, I'm sort of wondering if you have thought about any concerns about the way in which this concept of the state and vulnerability can lead to a reactionary nationalism.
A reactionary
Nationalism.
I don't have a rosy view of the state. What I have is an inevitable view of the state. I think that not only is the state always there and always active and always shaping our relationships and our institutions through law, so I do believe that. And what I'm interested in doing is figuring out how we can take that active role and make it more responsive to individuals, to vulnerable individuals, rather than only or primarily responsible to vulnerable markets, which is the way it's shaped now. So I don't think it's a rosy view. I think it's a view of inevitability. But it's more than that. It's also the recognition that the state is really the only thing that I can think of that is capable of mounting an effort and trying to control these international, global economic organizations of capital. There is nothing else that I can think of that's going to do that. So I would like to pour energy into empowering the state to fight our fight, and that means us getting involved in doing that and thinking of ways that it should. As for law reform, I believe that all reform of society is incremental. And it occurs in stages. It occurs when we actually call attention to the attention of the people to the way the society is actually functioning against their interests. And I saw this happen in the context of the gender revolution, gender equality revolution, where over the space of about 2 or 3 decades, we were very successful in making the state conceive of the family as a very different institution than it did 50 or 60 years ago. We took gender out of the state's definition of the family, for example. So it's important, I think, to remember, particularly important for young people, to remember that change can happen and has happened. And sometimes that change is for the better. But again, this is why it's important to always have the vulnerable subject as the pole star, so that you don't lose sight of that. That's supposed to be the objective of the reform, of the incremental changes. And I think one of the things that happened with the gender equality revolution, for example, is that we lost sight of the fact that the point of feminism was to better society, not only to better the position of women. There's a question about Angela?
Yeah, I'll ask you. So what I'm trying to get my thoughts around is that the other point of view. So the perspective of how you deal with vulnerability, because I assume, as you presented it, it's a human condition, and just
It's the human condition.
The human condition, right? And it's just a matter of how much resilience you are aided by through your lifespan. And so everyone experiences it, yet the other position feels there are other ways to manage it. Is that,
right,
in essence, so the belief system there is just, there's a different way to manage my old age.
Privately, right.
Right. And so it's just that they feel that's more efficient. It's not really the thinking that they're evil or that they don't care.
Well, some of them are involved. I'm never going to claim that they're talking, but no, but this is really important. This is the distinction between a vulnerability analysis and an anti-discrimination analysis. An anti-discrimination analysis is based on individual actions, individual intention, individual harm, right? And that's when cases are successfully argued, either in the court of public opinion or courts themselves, is when you can demonstrate that. A vulnerability approach does not require individuals to act in intentionally discriminatory ways, for them to be evil and plotting and planning. But the social harm involved in this is not the active harm of discrimination, but the harm, the passive harm of not responding to social institutions and arrangements that produce gross inequality in both power, political power, social power, and wealth. It's that's the social harm. It's a harm that's located within the organization of societal institutions and relationships, not one that's located in discrimination by individuals against other individuals. And the reason they think that privatization, of course, is a better way to deal with it is because if you actually made or recognized there's a public responsibility, that would mean the transfer of public resources to those social endeavors, which is the point of showing all the social resources that are funneled into market institutions. So then you can argue why responsive state are responsive to those institutions, but not to these other institutions that handle individual vulnerability. That's an equity argument.
I think we should wrap up. Thank you all for coming.